and thanks to AWC for the opportunity to be speaking here today. So today we're going to be talking about Chapter 7A, as the title implies. A lot of this presentation I developed a few years ago when I was with the University of California and working part-time for the State Fire Marshal's office. In that position, my duties included developing a presentation about Chapter 7A and being part of the teaching team that taught Californians about this new building code at the time, new part of the building code at the time that was going to affect new construction in wildfire-prone areas. So we taught this course in a number of places up and down the state, and members in the audience, our target audience were building officials and fire officials, people that, contractors, people that built things that might be on the outside of your house, people that sold things that might be on the outside of your house. So we tried to get to people that 7A would impact. So as I said, this is modified to bring it up to date with some of the requirements. Just as this slide indicates, the presentation, I built the presentation a number of years ago, modified it recently, but it was not at all funded by American Wood Council or the Softwood Lumber Board. So our overall goal, as I indicated, is just to get a better understanding of the requirements of Chapter 7A. And after completing the course, you should be able to know a little bit more about what these bulleted items say. So an understanding of the provisions as it relates to building in general, but in particular we'll be focusing on wood-based or wood frame construction, since that's the large kind of construction in the state. I want you to be able to understand how combustible materials in general, and exterior wood products in particular, can meet or not meet the provisions of Chapter 7A. Chapter 7A is a bit unique with regard to other wildfire kind of codes that are out there, in the sense that new testing standards were developed and adopted by the State Fire Marshal that were directly used in Chapter 7A. So we're going to talk about those standards and then talk about how they allow materials to comply, and discuss a little bit about materials that have complied with those ways. So our first poll question is coming up. So Marcy, back to you.
Sorry about that. Steve, you're also a little bit garbled, so we're kind of trying to figure out what that might be. So,
okay.
Let's see. The launch question here is, what is your profession? So this is a really easy one, folks. They get a little bit harder. So go ahead and vote. All right, I'm going to close the poll. And we're going to share the answers here. All right. So we have about 54% are engineers, 27% are code officials, 4% architects, and 14% other. No builders today.
Well, there you go. Yike. So thanks for answering that. I'm going to hold my little mic closer to my mouth, so let me know, Marcy, if this helps.
Absolutely, thank you.
Try to speak a little bit louder. So as you can see on this slide, we're going to walk through Chapter 7A generally by walking down this list of items, which is, in essence, gets to the house by component. And so we'll start generally just by talking about how buildings are exposed to wildfire, and then the other items on this list will, in essence, talk about how Chapter 7A addresses these kind of exposures or not in some cases. So homes and buildings in general in wildfire-prone areas need to be able to resist these three basic exposures: embers, or also called firebrands, radiant heat, and flame contact. So they're all here. Embers or firebrands are considered to be the most important exposure because of what they can do. So embers or firebrands can ignite combustible materials directly if they land on a combustible material or immediately next to a combustible material. And they can also result in indirect ignition of a home or building if they ignite combustible things close to the building. So they land and ignite a wood pile, they land and ignite a tool shed, they land and ignite bark mulch or combustible mulch near or next to the house, or vegetation near or next to the house. These kind of ignitions then result in either a radiant heat exposure to the building or a flame contact exposure to the building, depending on proximity. Direct flame contact is a pretty bad exposure, and the picture we see here, it's a debris in a gutter and a broom, which happens to be on a little deck, and you'll also notice that there's a wood pile underneath that deck, and all these things have ignited via an ember exposure and are resulting in a flame contact exposure to the side of the house, to the edge of the roof, depending on the thing that's burning. Radiant heat can preheat material, making it easier to ignite and transition to flaming combustion at some other point if the radiant heat exposure is long enough, or if it results in ignition of something closer to the house. Radiant heat can also break glass in a window, for example, and allow embers or flames to enter and ignite combustible furnaces in the house itself. So the first two, the ember firebrand exposure is a picture from our lab in South Carolina. And similarly for the flame contact exposure, the radiant heat exposure is from the so-called Pigeon Forge fire, which was in eastern Tennessee a little more than a year ago now, and that slide, as you can see, is a courtesy of the Tennessee Division of Forestry, so thanks to them for providing this. It's a pretty good example of radiant heat from one building to another. In this particular fire, 70-plus homes were damaged or lost, largely due to radiant heat from building to building. So anyway, so we'll be talking about these along throughout the rest of the seminar or webinar. So the next item we want to address is where is 7A applicable, and then some of the details about implementation of the code. So Chapter 7A is applicable to both residential and non-residential construction. As you see here, a nice new single-family residence, and then a little strip mall thing. But 7A applies to all construction, whether it be residential or non-residential. As is the case for most building codes, Chapter 7A only applies to new construction, and in essence, the date, so to speak, certain for new construction is roughly 2008. So if you put a new deck on a very old house, technically that deck doesn't have to comply. But if you put a new deck on a post-2008 house, then technically that deck would have to comply with the provisions of Chapter 7A. There are certain jurisdictions around the state you'll see, and this is why you really need to check with your local building official to find out how it was adopted, but certain jurisdictions, such as the one that I live in Northern California, in their adoption process they did include language which is typically called significant remodel language, so that if you add so much to the footprint of the house, then that will have to comply, and sometimes if you put a new deck on an old house, that new deck will have to comply also. So you need to check, but strictly from a state perspective, it's only new construction. Locally, sometimes it applies to remodel. There's a lot of acronyms that get thrown around when 7A and other code things are discussed, but some important acronyms related to Chapter 7A as you see here on this list, SRA, state responsibility area. These are typically unincorporated areas. Fire protection is provided by the state or by the county under contract, or by the state under contract with the county. So typically, if you're in the county area, then SRA. LRA, local responsibility area, that's typically the city of blank. And where 7A is applicable, it really depends on certain things related to whether you're SRA or LRA. FRA is federal responsibility area. It should be like homes that might be in a forest or a park, a national park. FRAP, Fire Resource and Assessment Program. This is a part of the Office of the State Fire Marshal. FRAP is the department or entity that does the mapping, that developed the criteria and identified these next three acronyms: the very high fire hazard severity zone, the high fire hazard severity zone, and the moderate fire hazard severity zone. So these FRAP determined which lands would be classified as these levels of fire hazard severity zone. And we'll see in the next slide or two what this means in terms of where it's applicable. So here we define FRAP again. They developed these zones. They've been mapping the state for these fire hazard severity zones for a number of years. I think the first one came out in roughly '85. It was done again before Chapter 7A rolled out. The model was based on fire behavior and this brand or ember development and these interface areas. They pretty much took the best that was available, and when they developed these severity maps, and the procedures are applied consistently. So what that really means is that you're not going to have a change in fire hazard severity at a political boundary. So at a county line, you're not going to automatically transition from one zone to another unless the other parts of the model say so. So that's what that boundary thing means. So they used fuels, slope, fire history, and then some measure of ember production based on vegetation. They developed these scores and a definition of burnability, or which was really the ability for the fire to burn into more urbanized area. This is typically at the interface, so between wildland and suburbia, let's say. And then they developed these scores, and based on these scores, they developed maps that would determine whether you're very high, or moderate. There is no such thing as low in this scheme of evaluation. A low might be if you're urban, like this downtown Los Angeles or downtown San Francisco, then you wouldn't have necessarily you wouldn't have a rating like that. So Chapter 7A was approved by the Building Standards Commission in September of 2005. It's applicable in all state responsibility areas, so no matter what your fire hazard severity zone is, Chapter 7A applies if you are in the SRA. It applies only in very high severity zones if you are in LRA, and you really need to check with your local building department to find out exactly where the zones are. You can get maps online, as I'll show you in the next slide, but it's just a summary table that just allows you to think in terms of where this 7A is applicable. So Chapter 7A across the board, LRA only in the very high fire hazard severity zones. Chapter 7A is a standalone chapter, but it does refer to other chapters, and significantly, it really defers to Chapter 15 for roofing provisions. Chapter 15 in the California Building Code already had language that required a Class A roof in very high severity zones, a Class B in high, and a Class C in moderate, and Chapter 7A doesn't change that. So here's our next question, and I'm going to turn it back to Marcy to handle it.
All right. Here we go. So in local responsibility areas, LRA, Chapter 7A is which applicable in very high fire hazard severity zones. Sometimes only or never applicable in very high fire hazard severity zones. All right. I'm again going to wait until about 75 or 80% of you have voted. All right, going to close it and then share. All right, so 63% say only applicable and 35% say sometimes applicable. So, Steve, what is the real answer?
The right answer is B only. Chapter 7A here to this table, and I apologize if the question is not clear enough for you, but it's really a critical distinction. LRA, because of various laws that have passed in California over the years, only if the area of the land within a city boundary is classified as very high, that's the only time that LRA, that this 7A would apply. So if you're in the city and you're in something designated as high, it doesn't apply, and if it's moderate, it doesn't apply. The local officials, if they really wanted to apply, they'll sort of force a very high rating. And the SRA, because the state gets to control it, they just made it apply across the board. So here are some maps that you can download from the State Fire Marshal's website. And the URL is at the base of the slide, but you don't need to worry about writing it down since this is going to be available later as a PDF. But you can go there, you can click on the county, and I just picked Alameda, which is across the bay from me, and you can get a county view. But in this map, you can see overall the red is very high and such. But even if you go to the county, which we see here, it's hard to know at a particular street level what the severity zone might be. So I think in all cases you're going to be needing to go visit your local building department and check it out. But these maps are available and they are updated on a regular basis. I understand they are getting ready to update them again. They were updated just before, as I indicated, just before this version of 7A rolled out. Or actually, this version was the only version, so 7A rolled out. But they're in the process of doing it again with newer technology and the like. You can get these maps for your county. LRA, there are LRA maps that are available. You see on the next slide, you can get in JPEG and PDF format information. If you're a GIS guy, you can get GIS layer stuff in terms of shape files and zip files on the State Fire Marshal's website. So once you get to that link that was in the previous slide, you can sort of walk you down through to find what's available, and typically things that they use and results of what they use are right there on the website. So it's a useful website, has a lot of information on it. 7A was implemented in 2 phases. As I indicated, in September of 2005, the Building Standards Commission adopted or approved 7A. It became effective almost immediately for roof coverings, since that had been in Chapter 15 for a while, and vents. Phase 2 followed a few years later, and because of getting the maps approved at a local level and LRA, it followed somewhat later than 2008, but today everything is in place. And so phase 2 addressed all the other parts of the house, that, you know, other exterior parts of the house, so siding, vents, wall vents, like a foundation vent, for example, doors, windows, decking, and projections. The delay between phase 1 and phase 2 was really intended to allow the industry to develop, if necessary, or get approved products that could comply with Chapter 7A provisions. Largely, this would be addressing combustible things because there were specific tests, as I indicated, that materials had to test to and then get that information to the State Fire Marshal's office, with this sort of lead time to get materials to comply and have them produced and available to the public. So that took some time. The commercial labs that were certified by the State Fire Marshal's office also had to gear up to actually do the tests. So there's a lot of moving parts for a while, and this delay allowed all those moving parts to come together. So at the end of the day, it worked pretty well. It definitely was a struggle during a moment or two during that time. So Chapter 7A, like most wildfire-related building codes, rely really on a coupled approach where there's a link between, an acknowledged link between vegetation on the property and building, and the building itself, you know, in terms of building materials and certain design things, so that there are provisions in 7A related to what's called defensible space or vegetation management on the property. And the SRA, the State Responsibility Area, they pretty much defer to this Public Resources Code 4291, PRC 4291. In the city, and for LRA, for the very high, they would the same kind of information is provided in this Government Code 51182. The bottom line is the home protection is acknowledged to be dependent on vegetation on the property and the house itself, and so both are there in Chapter 7A. The local authority having jurisdiction will determine who gets to decide about the compliance with regard to vegetation management. This part of the code really has resulted in a discussion typically between the building department in a given jurisdiction and the fire department in a given jurisdiction, since typically in most jurisdictions, fire department are vegetation people and building department are building people and materials people. And there's this discussion to decide who will determine the vegetation part. And sometimes it is the fire department or the fire marshal typically, and sometimes it is the building department. But if you go to the building department, you'll find out who that person is. I think it's a pretty smooth transition, but it did encourage that conversation between these two departments, and locally you'll know which one you need to go to for this part. So as I said, a number of test procedures came along with Chapter 7A, and so we're going to just walk through these. There are, as you can see here, roughly 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. They deal with the various components. This is the latest version. The first time it came out, you know, there has been one revision since it came out in 2008, and there was some change in the State Fire Marshal standards, but we're going to walk through them. So 127A-1 through 5. 1 is exterior wall, 2 is windows, 3 is a projection such as a soffitted eave or other kind of a horizontal projection. 4 and 4A deal with decking, and then 5, in essence, is the extended E84, which is now a new ASTM standard, E2768. As you can see in the brackets, during 2008, between 2008 and now, there have been some ASTM activity within the subcommittee on exterior fire, E05.14, and some of these state fire marshal standards have been converted largely, are based on the state fire marshal standards, have been converted to ASTM standards. So there is one for the wall, for example. The one for the horizontal projections is under development still, but it is an active task group, and so I expect it to be a new standard here pretty soon. There are a couple of standards, ASTM standards related to decking, and then there is the ASTM standard for the extended E84. And the extended E84 or 2768 really is just a way to define this term called ignition resistant material. So we're going to go on and talk about each one of these separately. So these tests were developed at the University of California Forest Products Lab, at the University of California Fire Lab in the sort of early 2000s. And then they were passed as protocols to the State Fire Marshal's office, and the State Fire Marshal has the authority to develop or create a State Fire Marshal standard. That's what happened. So you're going to see in this picture, there's three pictures within this slide. The wall test, the horizontal projection test, and the window test all use the same apparatus. And it's the apparatus that you see in the wall test figure on the front side. So these are all flame contact or flame impingement tests using a gas burner. The wall test is a fire penetration or fire resistance test, as are the others of the window test and the horizontal projection. The horizontal projection test. These are all fire resistance tests. We'll see some more pictures later on, but these are, in essence, the State Fire Marshal standard dictates, prescribes the heat output or the energy output of the burner, and then also prescribes the burner on time, the observation time, and then each one of these has failure or passing criteria. So you can't have a burn through the horizontal projection or the wall or the window. The window doesn't care whether there's glass breakage or frame failure. You can't have flames passing from the outside to what would be the inside. There we go there. This is a picture, next slide, just is a picture of the window, a window test. So again, you have that line burner in the upper left-hand picture that would be positioned at the base of the wall that the window is contained in the lower right-hand picture. The little white dots you see in the window panes, these are just radiometers that measure the radiant heat that might be passing through the window. Again, the heat output is prescribed, the burner on time is prescribed, and you're looking for flame penetrating through the window, either by breaking the glass or burning through the frame and entering what would be the living space behind the window. So here's just a couple of pictures of frame failure in the left-hand picture and glass breakage in the right-hand picture. Both of these would be considered a failure, and so as built, neither one of these windows would comply with this particular test. The next slide shows the method 4A for decking. As we're going to see when we get to the decking part in terms of what the code asks for, the deck part only really has requirements for the part of the deck that you can walk on. So the landing, the deck itself, it doesn't address the structural support system or the railing. It's only the part of the deck that you walk on. And here we see the left-hand picture is later on, after the burner is off, and the picture also shows after the burner is off. There are a few acceptance criteria for the deck. One is the heat release rate for this under deck part. The deck has actually two components, and the 4A is the under deck only, which is a flame impingement test. So you have to meet a certain minimum heat release rate requirement. In addition, for the full out 4A requirement, you cannot have a debris drop from the burning deck. So the right-hand picture where you see the little droplets of burning debris, this deck would not also comply with this provision in the code because of the dropping of the debris. There are two parts to the code, to the standard, and the second part is a burning brand part, and we're seeing here a Class A brand from the ASTM E108 test, which is on this deck, and this particular part of the test is done on an E108 type of wind tunnel. And again, there are requirements for passing the deck, the test. Anyway, this is, I apologize for that phone. And I think that the building, one good thing about this is that the Building Materials Listing Program within the State Fire Marshal's office has developed this procedure for you to know which products comply and which products don't. So you can go to the Building Materials Listing website, and you see the category link there. There's a drop-down menu that allows you to look for other other WUI Chapter 7A components, so siding, soffits, and the windows if there are any there, and ignition resistant materials. And then you can just search for all those products that comply via those particular standards, and find out products that do meet the requirements. So that's an easy way to find out what passes and what doesn't, and what you can use in terms of combustible materials. Materials that are non-combustible, actually, you're not going to find them on this list, but they will comply because they are non-combustible. And you would just look on the manufacturer's list to make sure that it meets the ASTM E136 requirement for non-combustibility. Typically, you can find markings on products to know that they comply also. So this is a picture on a house that's actually being remodeled in a community that has remodeling requirements in terms of complying with Chapter 7A. So you'll see that inset picture that says California wildfire exposure. It's telling you that particular product does comply. So that's another way to know. And if you don't want to go to the Building Materials Listing Program site, decking boards are often also marked individually, so you can look there also. So I just wanted to, even though, since ASTM E108 for roof coverings was already on the books, Chapter 7A, by deferring to Chapter 15, really points to each chapter, to ASTM E108 for the test used to comply roofing products. This is just showing you a test of a roofing product, so you'll know generally the kinds of the test that is used to comply roof coverings. And this is one we did at our lab in California, again in the early 2000s. So this is a Class A test. These two pictures are linked. So as built, this particular roofing assembly is not Class A because the burning brand on the top resulted in fire being transferred through the roofing materials and the assembly, and burning through. In the lower right-hand picture, we see burn through into what would be your attic space. So as such, this would be a failure, and so you would have to, the manufacturer would have to develop a different way. Typically, you can use an assembly to comply products in the roof, and so they'd have to have a different assembly in order for this particular assembly to work. And this is ASTM E119, a vertical furnace test. Chapter 7A does allow for a 1 hour rating to comply, an assembly with a 1 hour rating to comply, and that 1 hour rating is developed in a furnace such as this, where you where the burner, where the wall is put in place, the burners follow this time temperature curve shown in the inset, and if burn through occurs, then it isn't a 1 hour wall. If burn through doesn't occur, in essence, it is a 1 hour wall. And those are one way for walls to comply, is by being a 1 hour assembly. And this is the E84 horizontal Steiner tunnel. I'm showing you this because for decking materials, you need to provide your flame spread index of the material, and it does impact the kind of siding that can be used next to the deck in some cases. And this is the same tunnel that is used for the extended E84 test, or the ASTM E2768, which is an extended 84, which is the same as State Fire Marshal's 127A-5. This extended test, which is 30 minutes long compared to the normal 10 minutes for the E84, for the flame spread index, is the test that is used to determine whether or not the material can be considered an ignition-resistant material. And if a material can be considered that, then it's often a way for it to comply. Okay. This is just a picture showing a fire retardant treatment facility in Canada. I'm showing you this because often treated wood, exterior-rated fire treated wood, is a way to comply, either because it is that or because it meets this ignition-resistant material criteria. And from a state level, fire retardant treated wood shakes with Class A rating, typically by assembly, can comply if it meets the State Fire Marshal mandated natural weathering cycle, which is in essence a 10-year natural weathering cycle, but the product can be sold after 5 with successful testing at the control, no weathering, at 3 years, and then 5 years it can be sold at that point. So this is typically a 2-step process. You treat it, and then you heat, and then it goes into a kiln to be heated. This is what sets up the chemical and sort of fixes it so that it resists leaching. So I see a question here. CSA to DM only shows combustible products. It also show ignition-resistant materials, and it'll show some windows which may or may not be combustible. So you can look for BML, building material listing, for more than just combustible things. If I said otherwise, I apologize for that. So we're going to now step through what the code says about roof coverings and the other components. So again, this was a phase 1 component, so it's been on the books for a number of years because it basically just pointed to Chapter 15 and had some additional provisions. So Class A and the very high, and B and high, and C and moderate. So that just defers to Chapter 15. Chapter 7A requires protection in valleys where you have metal in the valley. So if you have metal flashing in the valley, then you will, and then the code says you're going to underlay that valley with a particular kind of a roll roofing product. As it can be called 72 pound, but it's a heavier duty type 72 roll roofing. You underlie the valley, and then you lay down the metal. If you have asphalt comp shingles and you choose to weave them in the valley construction, then you don't need to do anything else. You don't need to install the additional roll roofing underneath that. If you leave the valley or you use what's called a California cut, you don't need to use this additional material. Gutters, there's a statement regarding gutters. We'll talk about gutters in a minute, so I won't discuss that right now. And then there is language regarding attic vents, and the attic vent language is that the vents must resist the ignition from intrusion. It must resist entry of burning embers and flames. So it's resist, not prevent. Right now, the language allows for openings between 1/16 and 1/8. So Chapter 7A, at least, doesn't allow a 1/4 inch mesh. A lot of testing has shown that 1/4 inch allows for a number of embers to enter. There are some maintenance issues with 1/16 and 1/8 of an inch that we'll get to in a second. But I think it's important to note that 1/16 and 1/8 don't prevent. They just minimize the number and minimize the size of embers that can enter. So I think I've just said this already. Roofs shall comply with 7A and 15. You can have assembly-rated materials, and here's just a picture of a fire retardant-treated shake with an assembly-rated Class A. That assembly-rated Class A, in this case, is accomplished by the addition of a gypsum fiberglass material that is used above the sheeting, below the shake. The treated shake by itself is a Class B, and can achieve this Class A with this gypsum fiberglass product. You can use a roll roofing product again and accomplish the same thing, and any material that you can insert that would allow it to pass the test would be okay. As I said earlier, a natural weathering procedure has to be completed for the state. There are certain, again, local jurisdictions that have more stringent requirements for treated roofing products anyway, but you have to look locally for that. The 7A says that if you have a roof covering that allows for a gap between the roof covering and the roof deck, then you're going to plug that opening. And as you can see in these next pictures and the pictures in this slide, there's a couple of ways to do it. You can use a commercial product, or you can do it a homemade product, so to speak. The upper left is a commercial product. As you can see here, it still allows for gaps. The point of the code is really to prevent birds or rodents or other animals from getting between the roof covering and roof deck and building nests. These fine fuels that in these nests are easily ignited by embers that can pass underneath the roof covering, ignite that fine fuels in the nest, for example, and other debris that happens to flow up in there, and you end up with a flaming exposure to the structural members. And it's easier for that, in that scenario, to have fire burning into the attic space or the structural members supporting the roof. The lower right-hand picture is a picture I took in Malibu back in the day, and it's just a homemade job using a dyed mortar mix to plug the ends of this clay rail tile roof. It's that, you know, and the guy is just not done yet, and that's why there's some that are empty and some that are not. So as I said, in the metal, if you interweave, okay. The upper left shows interweaving, you're okay with that. If you have metal, then you're going to put a cap sheet, roll a cap sheet full width up the valley, and then apply the metal. Skylights, since it's on a roof, no requirements for skylights. You know, educational organizations suggest closing operable skylights, the same way that it's suggested to close windows if you're evacuating for a fire, but there's nothing in Chapter 7A about skylights. Now we're going to move and talk a little bit more specifically about gutters. So the wording in 7A for gutters is shown here. Roof gutters shall be provided with a means to prevent, and the language is prevent, the accumulation of debris. It's a hard thing, but there isn't any wording to tell the code official how to do this, and but the typical interpretation across the state has been to require some kind of gutter cover device. And I think there isn't, from what I've seen at least, there isn't anything beyond that. If you put a gutter cover device on it, you will comply with 7A. I think all those of you that are in the business sort of know there isn't a standard procedure to evaluate how well they work. There's no restriction in 7A that says you cannot use a combustible gutter cover or you must use a non-combustible gutter cover. Just any kind of gutter cover seems to be working, but that seems to be the typical interpretation of this code, and many gutter cover devices do not prevent. They may minimize, and the reason why this provision is in 7A, if you see this particular, in this picture you see a lot of debris in the gutter. This is a metal gutter. Testing at our facility and other facilities, NIST, for example, has shown that debris in gutters is easily ignited, and burning debris in a gutter doesn't expose really the field of the Class A roof. This is an asphalt comp roof with Class A classification, but it's the edge of it, and so it's the fascia, the sheathing, if not protected, that this burning debris in the gutter will impinge on, not the roof itself. And so there's wording in the code to address this vulnerability of that roofing assembly. Okay, so we're going to move on to attics. So again, attic ventilation resists the intrusion of burning embers and flames. So resist, not prevent. The way that you can accomplish this these days is by having a non-combustible, so metal mesh screen, openings between 1/16 and 1/8, nothing about a quarter anymore. Materials must be non-combustible. There is an exception for a ridge vent that it says if you have a wire mesh around the ridge vent, it would be okay. You'll notice in this picture, though, that since a lot of ridge vents are plastic, are combustible, then the debris in front of this ridge vent would result in a flame impingement exposure to that ridge vent. So that, again, there's a lot of, code doesn't say this, but a lot of the educational organizations are pretty diligent about telling people to keep debris off the roof, and it's because of things like this that you just can't get around. So there is language in Chapter 7A that restricts use of vents in the under eave area, and the exceptions are two. And one is that if that vent has been shown to resist the intrusion of flame and burning embers, and then number two, you can go the screen option, which is 1/16 or 1/8 of an inch mesh, if these following things apply. You have a automatic sprinkler system installed in the attic. You have exterior siding and enclosure in the soffit area of non-combustible materials, or this ignition-resistant material, which is material that's complied with this extended 30-minute E84 kind of a test. And thirdly, that the vent is more than 12 feet off the ground, so the soffitted area is more than 12 feet off the ground. Otherwise, you are getting your inlet and outlet air from the top of the roof, for example, as we show in this picture here. So you have an inlet vent, nominal inlet vent, which would be close to the roof edge, but still above the attic, and an outlet vent, which is a through roof vent close to the ridge, and as this picture shows. There have been a number of vents that have done some testing at a commercial fire lab that has been approved by the State Fire Marshal's office. They have provided that test information to the State Fire Marshal's office, and the State Fire Marshal's office has accepted them for use in these wildfire-prone areas. And these vents, so you can see here, there's 3 of them that have been accepted. brand guard is the one on the left. It uses a baffle design. Vulcan, the upper right, uses intumescent honeycomb mesh with screening. The brand guard vent also has screening. And then the O'Hagan off-ridge kind of event uses some baffling and some steel wool to resist intrusion of embers and flames. The State Fire Marshal gave kind of a 5-year period for ASTM to pass a standard test method. You'll notice that there isn't a State Fire Marshal's standard test method for events. ASTM missed that line, and so technically these aren't accepted, but the manufacturers and the State Fire Marshal was careful to use the word accept rather than approve, because at the time there wasn't an approved test standard. And so they were accepting them for use in State Fire Marshal monitored projects. And that's all they were telling you. And I think the presumption was if it's good enough for the State Fire Marshal's office, it's good enough for me, a local authority having jurisdiction. And that's typically how it's worked. So these are now, I think these manufacturers are now working through with commercial labs again, now that there is a standard test method which was passed a few months ago, this ASTM E2886 standard test method for evaluating the ability of exterior vents to resist embers and direct flame impingement. As I say here, it doesn't really apply for ridge and off-ridge, but it does apply for under eave, gable end, foundation vents, and the State Fire Marshal now knows that this standard has been passed, and ASTM is working with the State Fire Marshal's office to get the language to look into the next iteration of the 7A code. So it's just a process, but I think that manufacturers can test to this standard, provide that information to the State Fire Marshal's office, and they would then consider it the way they considered the other testing that was done years ago after 7A was passed, but before ASTM subcommittee passed this particular ballot. So here we are. We're roughly halfway through, and I just wondered whether there's any questions. So I think I'm going to turn it back to Marcy, and we'll see.
Actually, Steve, you got me. It's Buddy, and we did have a couple of questions
Great.
come in. Let's start with this one. With the severity zones in the maps, do you think it will eventually be available from a website so you can just type in your address or zip code to give the zone designation rather than reading from a map, or are the maps pretty detailed to clearly show those zones?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Thank you for that. It is fairly straightforward. The college, the Center for Fire Research and Outreach, which is an entity within the College of Natural Resources at UC Berkeley, did have SETIA look up for state responsibility areas a long time ago. We, at the time, it was we, but it's now been taken off because the same kind of response couldn't be provided for LRA. But I think the answer to the question really is I think certain local jurisdictions do that. And I'm sure that the building official has a pretty easy way to look up to see whether it's in or out, and the question though is whether it's going to be available to you. And I think in some jurisdictions it will be, but it's a question I'm pretty sure that would have to be asked at the local level. It's something that is technically doable. You use, one of these Google or Yahoo Maps, a mapping system that is always up to date, and it's just a sort of a GIS thing where you overlay the severity zones on that map, and the lookup part is pretty straightforward. It's just whether at the local level they've done it, and I think many have.
Okay, great. Here's another one. Is Chapter 7A only applicable in LRA areas if the local agency adopts the fire maps? And then there's a follow-up question.
Okay. So I guess I'm going to answer that question the way that I understood it to be, and I think this is the way that it still is. The State Fire Marshal's Office, or FRAP, provided their version of the map to the local authority, and then there was a discussion back and forth about, about the map, and the local jurisdiction could argue with cause that something that was in shouldn't be, or something that wasn't should be. It went both ways. Once they, though, agreed on what the map should be, then adopting the map, getting Chapter 7A was part of adopting the map. So at least the way that it was supposed to work and the way that I think it has worked, but this is more a question that would be better answered, with certainty by the State Fire Marshal's office. But the way that it was supposed to work is that you got the map, 7A came with it, and so you didn't have have an option to say no. Once you agreed with the State Fire Marshal's office that the very high was in this area, and you adopted it, there was the code right there with it. So I think I'm hedging because I know the way it was supposed to work. I'm not quite sure if it worked that way every time.
The follow-up question is, do you know which agency adopts the maps? Is it the fire department or the city or county, or a combination of the two?
So it's above the fire department. I think it's the authority that would adopt the building code. But I'm sure there is discussion amongst the approval authority, whether it's county commissioners or some level in the city. I'm not quite sure actually who has the ultimate authority to do that approval, but it seems to me that it's something above the fire department level, or something above the building department level.
Okay, great. Well, there's another question has to do with the term significant remodel. Is there a more specific percentage of remodel area to be considered significant?
So I've heard 25% or so increase in footprint of the house, but this significant remodel always is whatever the local entity decides it is, and whatever they decide is what it is. So in my county, and certain parts of the county, you don't need to increase the footprint at all if you put a new deck on, for example. That new deck will apply. So I don't think there's a one size fits all. It's significant remodel is just a catch-all, because that what exactly it means is really a function of where you happen to be wanting to build, and the authority that is present there.
Okay, well that's all the questions we have for now. We'll again let folks know that there'll be another Q&A toward the end of your presentation. So if you have additional questions, go ahead and send those in along the way, and we'll have some time at the end, Steve. So I'll turn it back over to you.
Great, thanks, buddy. So I'll just sort of walk through the pictures here in this particular slide. These are all from our test lab, and so they just sort of show certain things. The upper left-hand picture, the left-hand gutter is a vinyl gutter. It will typically detach and fall to the ground if it's ignited. If debris in it is ignited, a metal gutter will pretty much stay put, as we see the right-hand gutter. The upper right picture is just debris next to a dormer, side-in dormer. It is also easily ignited by these embers. So this is just demonstrating the importance of embers. The lower right-hand picture, debris igniting in a valley. And then the lower right-hand picture is our recent experiments addressing or evaluating or trying to understand the vulnerability of vents, and this is in the attic space. The little white streaks or bright streaks are embers entering through the vents in blocking and open eave construction. So just so you know what's going on in this set of pictures if you're interested. I need to get back here. Okay, so phase 2, now we're going to start walking through phase 2. So beginning in 2008, it was later than that a little bit with LRA, but with SRA, 2008, January 1, all these other components came into play. If you want, look for these standards that will address each one of these components that we talked about earlier, the standards we talked about earlier, but it's in this link that you can see at sort of the middle of the slide. If you just don't want to remember that link and you search wildfire protection building construction, you'll get to it. The thing to remember with a lot of these components, and I think it's pretty typical for code language, is that there's a lot of or statements. So the user is given options to comply for a given component. And you can pick one or another, and either one of them will work. So these are not and statements, they are or statements. So let's first talk about eaves. 127A-3 provides one way for eave construction to comply. And so you can, if you have a combustible eave material, you can test it, or if that eave material, say soffit material, is already classified as ignition resistant, then you don't need to test at 127A-3, you can just use it. If you have a material that is like a fiber cement product that is rated as non-combustible, then you don't need to test to 127A-3, you can just use it. So test to 127A-3, or use something that's already classified as an ignition-resistant material, or use something that's already been classified as non-combustible. For 127A-3, you can't have burn through the material into what would be the attic or the enclosed eave area, not necessarily the attic, but the boxed-in part. And so this picture on the right-hand side is, again, from UC testing, and it's from the perspective of the camera in the attic looking into that under eave area. So this particular construction wouldn't work because of this burn through that we see there. This is some pictures from a study that I did a while ago, but the upper left-hand picture is a flame impingement exposure to the underside of an open eave construction, and then the lower right-hand picture is a soffited eave construction, combustible materials every place. Chapter 7A allows for open eave construction if you use a minimum of 2-inch thick in the rafter and 2-inch thick in the blocking. So there is that exception. The picture, that slide before, sort of implied that you were using a soffited eave or a boxed-in eave all the time. There is this exception in the 7A code that allows for normal kind of open eave if you have this minimum 2-inch material in the rafter in the blocking. But you also must comply with the vent provisions if you're going to have venting in the under eave area there. So that's what the eaves say. Now we're going to talk about exterior walls. There's a number of ways for exterior walls to comply. So in this bullet, we can see you're going to be non-combustible or ignition resistant. And I should say that if you are going to be ignition resistant material, then you have already passed an accelerated weathering procedure. You've already done accelerated weathering, and you've passed this extended EA4 test in order to be considered an ignition resistant material. So there is a weathering component tied to that. So you can be non-combustible or IRM. You can be heavy timber or log wall. They define heavy timber and log wall with certain dimensions that we'll talk about in a second. Let's see. The third way is just to comply with 1278-1. For 1278-1, it's a fire resistance or penetration test. So it's fire moving from the outside of the building to the inside the stud cavity. Weathering is not required when you're going by this option. So as I said, 1 hour wall is one way to comply. Also, if you have a 1 hour construction, then or the exterior portion of a 1 hour construction, sort of the GIF that we see in this particular picture, that's a way to comply. Here's a picture from our test at the fire lab at UC Berkeley. So the burn through that we see on the right-hand picture indicates that as built, this is a way to comply. And as such, this would not comply because you had the burn through at the lap joint. 7A does allow for the use of sheathing as part of the assembly, so we didn't have sheathing here just to make it easier to see what was going on at the lap joints, but in real practice, if you're going to do this test, typically you're going to have a sheathing product. In California in particular, because of the seismic requirements, sheathing will almost always be there. You can count the sheathing as part of the assembly and use it in the test. What 1278-1 does not do, though, is talk anything about or have any requirements on flame spread up the wall. So you see on the left-hand picture that flames do go up to the eave, and the presumption is that you have a window that complies and an under eave that can comply, and that you've also, what is never forgotten in 7A is that you also have a vegetation management or defensible space that also complies. And so it's all these things are playing and minimizing the opportunity for homes to ignite or buildings to ignite. So this is just a quick slide showing the dependence on lap joint pattern to resistance of flame penetration or fire penetration. The plain bevel siding products shown on the left really don't work well for a combustible product. If it's an exterior rated fire retardant treated wood siding product, it works much better than what's shown here. So this is really for this burn through time of 1 minute, really a non-treated plain bevel siding product. And similarly, if this plain bevel pattern is tied to a fiber cement product, for example, a non-combustible product, the same 1 minute doesn't really apply. It's much longer with a non-combustible joint. For a combustible, non-treated product, you really need to get to a more complicated lap joint like this shiplap or tongue and groove would also do the same. You just have a much longer resistance time to penetration, so much higher resistance to flame penetration. And so combustible products that comply typically use either they're treated, or they use this 1 hour construction, or they use this more complicated lap joint like we see on the right-hand picture. So it's either going to be a shiplap or a tongue and groove kind of pattern. Log wall is fine, heavy timber is fine. Log wall we define in the code. The code defines log wall with a diameter greater than 6 inches, and heavy timber, smallest dimension is 4 inches. So this is how they define these things, and so these are also ways to comply with 7A provisions. Chapter 7A says nothing about fascia, it says nothing about trim. So it's silent on these on these issues, the same way that it's silent on the skylight that we talked about earlier. So here's the next question, so I'll turn it back to Buddy or someone. We'll see. Marcy,
all right, this is a poll question. So poll questions are me. Let's see, exterior walls shall be one of the following. And actually I'm reading from the slide and not the poll. So here's the poll. Exterior walls shall be one of the following. A, approved non-combustible or ignition-resistant material. B, heavy timber or log wall construction. C, it shall provide protection from the intrusion of flames into the stud cavity when tested in accordance with a state fire marshal test standard. D, all of the above, or E, letters A and C. All right. All right, about 50% of you have voted. Everybody keep voting. I'd like to try to do this quickly. We're up to 76%. I'm about to close. Get your vote in here at the last minute, squeak in, and I'm closing. And then I'm going to share. Let's see, 85% say all of the above. 12% say letters A and C, and then just a couple for A and C. Nobody thinks heavy timber. So, and then I'm going to hide. And Steve, you can share the actual results.
So the answer is all of the above. Heavy timber or log wall are ways to comply with Chapter 7A if you meet the definition of log wall and heavy timber in terms of size. So all these three, A, B, and C, are ways to comply with Chapter 7A. There's a number of ways for combustible things to comply and non-combustible. So off we go. Let's talk about windows. Again, a few ways for windows to comply, and we have these OR statements, so you can pick one. Insulating glass units with a minimum of one tempered pane. The code lets you decide whether it's the inner pane or the outer pane. If it's a dual pane, you can have a glass block, or you can have a fire rating of not less than 20 minutes when tested in accordance to NFPA 257, which is using that vertical furnace device that we showed, the E119 kind of vertical furnace device that we showed in a previous slide. Or it can meet the performance requirements of 127A-2. And so that's that same standard that uses the apparatus that siding is tested with. It has the burner at the base of the wall, flame impingement up the wall, and you cannot have glass breakage or ignition of flame and burn through into what would be the living space of the building or the occupied space of the building. So any one of these four ways are perfectly fine ways to comply. Because of the first bullet, one pane tempered, that is sort of an easy prescriptive way to comply. That is the way that most all window manufacturers have chosen to use, because you'll see here that the code is silent on frame type, so any frame type is okay. It's all about the glass. There's a number of studies that have shown that the glass is the most vulnerable part of the window. Some glass manufacturers have decided that they're not going to give you only one pane tempered, and they're going to provide two panes tempered or nothing at all. Some manufacturers allow you to choose the inner or outer, but the bottom line is a window that has tempered glass is the most common way to comply. Because this explicitly does not allow for laminated glass, some manufacturers, window manufacturers that have laminated glass in windows and want them to be sold into these wildfire-prone areas, they are then now testing the 127A-2. but for the most part, it's tempered glass is the way that that manufacturers are using to comply. Again, this is a picture, sort of what I showed before. So glass breakage in the left-hand picture, frame failure in the right-hand picture, but it's really just the glass that is the key thing from a 7A perspective. You're going to be seeing these tempered bugs on glass, on windows that comply. The one possible exception to indifference on frame type, based on a number of studies, is vinyl framing. But as long as the vinyl frame has this metal reinforcement that you see in the inset picture, this kind of deformation that you see in the main picture, where you have deformation of frame and fallout of IGU unit at exposures less than that required to break the glass, that this kind of deformation doesn't happen. Most windows have this reinforcement for the locking mechanism part of code requirements, and so sort of safety and breaking and entering kind of things, and wind load issues. So it's unusual to find windows that don't have this. I think in California you should be making sure this happens, but the major manufacturers do this. They have it, just because it's easier to meet the other provisions, not 7A provision, but other provisions of the code. But that's the kind of thing you're looking for, and this is particularly in this meeting rail area of hung windows, and the same would apply for a slider kind of window. Okay. So the decking is next, and I see this note in the panel, and I just want to confirm that when we're talking about under eave, open eave, it's a nominal 2 for the blocking, a nominal 2 for the rafter tail, not an actual but a nominal. So it'd be like an 1.5 inches. It'd be a normal 2x4 we are used to. Sorry for not incorporating the word nominal in that description. So decking materials, there's a couple of ways that decks are vulnerable to wildfires. One is if you have ember deposition on top of the deck, or underneath the deck for that matter, or flames coming up from underneath the deck, either because of overhanging slope or because of some vegetation between the wildland, so-called, and the house itself. Either one of these are ways that the deck can be vulnerable, because decks, you basically try to access your deck somehow. You can have sliding glass doors as shown in this picture, and often windows are close or over a deck. So decks are critical parts and a vulnerable feature, because if they ignite, the fire will have a much easier way to get into the house, either by breaking glass in the window or door, or a sliding glass door, or igniting combustible siding. All of those things are playing in the deck that you see here. And so 7A trying to get around this with this deck walking surface provision. So we'll look a little bit about that. So the ways that decking surfaces can comply, you can, number one provision is a pretty severe condition, and I'll say up front that it is one that has never been used to my knowledge. It's constructed with an ignition-resistant material, and this is a pretty critical and pass the performance requirements of both 7A-4 and 5. So 5 is the ignition-resistant material part of the code. So being ignition-resistant material means that you pass 12.7A-5, but you also are passing all of 12.7A-4, which is the underdeck flame impingement part of 12.7A-4, and the brand on top of the deck, and it is a Class A brand. So it's the Class A from an E108 roof test. So you can be that Or there's three other ways. Or you are an exterior rated fire retardant treated wood, so that it's flat out. If you are that, you can comply. If you're a non-combustible material, you can comply. Or if you comply with 1278-4A, which is the underdeck only part of the test, then you can also comply. If you comply that way, then you need to provide your your flame spread index, and if you are a Class C, then siding must be non-combustible or ignition-resistant material. Otherwise, you just need to comply with the provisions of the code. Other sort of flame, any way that the siding could comply would be okay. So there's a number of ways to comply. If you are a combustible decking material, so if you're a wood, a untreated, non-fire retardant treated decking material, or you are a wood plastic composite, you are complying via number 4 provision for the most part. Every example that I know of, that's how you're complying by number 4. So we're going to sort of walk through these options that we just talked about, but here it is in table form. I think it makes it easier to understand. So you are an ignition-resistant material. This is option 1. This is sort of the severe one. And you've done parts A and B of 1278-4, meeting all of the acceptance criteria tied to each one of these parts. So heat release rate requirement we've never talked about by a number, but it is 25 kilowatts per square foot. The deck will put itself out after 40 minutes. It cannot drop flaming debris, and it cannot break under its own load. So all of these things must be complied with in order to meet Part A provisions. Part B, there isn't heat release rate part to it, but all the other components to Part A are present in Part B, so you need to self-extinguish, put yourself out in 40 minutes. You can't drip flaming debris, and you cannot break under your own load. So it's a fairly tall order. Many decking materials cannot comply with this. Option 4, so if we go back to this one, option 4, this is the way that most decking products comply, most combustible decking products comply this way. And you'll notice that you don't need to worry about Part B at all, and you just need to meet the heat release rate part of Part A. If you comply this way, you're going to provide your flame spread index, which is a 10-minute E84. And if you have a Class C, then you will the siding next to the deck will be non-combustible or ignition resistant. Earlier, I had talked about the dimension for heavy timber. 7A says that heavy timber is anything that you have at least a nominal 4-inch dimension to be considered heavy timber, a nominal 4. So I bring the San Diego County compliance in just because it's a big county. I think some particularly wood plastic composite manufacturers that sell throughout the state and want to also sell in San Diego County just provide that product for the entire state. So it's I think important enough to show the same table or same figure for San Diego, because often a wood plastic composite will meet this criteria and not this criteria that we see in this option 4. So the differences are here. So you don't need to completely self-extinguish. In the underdeck part, glowing is still allowed after 40 minutes, but no flaming. That's the distinction. But still cannot drop debris, cannot break under own load. And then the brand test, again, the self-extinguish part has been deleted and glowing is inserted, so you're allowed to glow but not flame. So this is San Diego for any kind of combustible product, one that doesn't comply, otherwise it's being ignition resistant or non-combustible. This is the way that it will comply. So in California, as I said, option 4, and potentially this particular San Diego option for some manufacturers will be the product that you're going to get around the state. When I was with UC, I did a lot of workshops up and down the state that always included a fire demonstration, and this is one from Weaverville several years ago, and it just shows the difference in how combustible decking products can perform. This is not the standard test method. It is just a demonstration, but I think it shows performance differences. All 3 of these decks, as you see in the inset picture in the lower left, had a burning Class B brand from ASTM E108 kind of Class B brand, which is a 6-inch by 6-inch 3-layer construction of 3/4 inch Douglas fir sticks nailed together. The middle of the 3 layers is perpendicular to the upper and top and bottom. Anyway, so a Class B burning brand set on all 3 decks, and then 35 minutes later, the big picture is what you see. So the untreated redwood deck on the far right was pretty much out. The 7A compliant and the untreated redwood deck, it also complies with Chapter 7A provisions. The wood plastic composite in the middle also put itself out, in essence, within that 40-minute period. So this was 35 minutes into the test after putting the B brand on it. The non-compliant wood plastic composite is the far left deck, and again, all these were this one Class B brand set on top. So it wasn't a Class A brand, it was a Class B brand, and that short amount of, in the 30-minute interval, that the small fire from the Class B became somewhat of a larger fire on the non-compliant wood plastic composite, and in essence put themselves out on the compliant products, either untreated wood or the complying wood plastic composite in the middle. So I think this is one of the good things about 7A, is that it does provide another way to discriminate performance of nominally combustible decking products, as we see here. So a next question. So Marcy, back to you for a second.
All righty, here we go. This is a straight true false question. Chapter 7A only addresses the walking surfaces of decks. True or false? I'm going to let it go for about 5 more seconds here. Alrighty, and then let's share it. All right, about 63% say false and 37% say true. And all right,
so the answer is true. Yeah. Only Chapter 7A only addresses the walking surface of the deck. So the part of the deck you can walk on is what 7A addresses. The presumption is that there's a couple of reasons why the other parts of the deck, particularly the structural support system, isn't addressed. One is because of the tying of defensible space or vegetation management on the property to Chapter 7A. So the presumption is that you've done a good job of that. Otherwise, you wouldn't have been given, permission to build. You have to provide evidence of what you're going to do. There isn't a follow-up per se, so there isn't like a 5-year checkup to make sure you've done it or that you still maintain it. But that's the presumption. The other one is that currently there isn't. Most of our structural support system is wood-based, and there isn't currently a dual, commercially available at least, dual treatment that provides both resistance to decay and insects and fire. And so the feeling amongst the group that actually was gathered together to provide input to Chapter 7A, the decay / insect hazard, so to speak, what was more important for decks in general. And I think if you think about, if those of you that live in California know that the odds of your deck getting rained on is quite high, and less of a chance that it will be exposed by a fire. So it's that, again, but you can't really depart from the fact that 7A does acknowledge the importance of vegetation, and since it's part of the code, that was the logic of the committee anyway, is that, and so that resulted in just the walking surface being addressed in the code. It was easier to do. Some codes, for example, the ICC, WUI code, have provisions for enclosing the deck. If you enclose the deck and don't address, again, moisture issues, you're going to end up with corroding fasteners potentially, and decaying wood potentially. So boxing in or enclosing the deck, has its own issues if you don't address the water problem. So anyway, so let's move on. I've got to get back to the screen. Here we go. Okay, so next couple of things before we sort of end here is doors. So doors, again, 3 ways to comply. They're going to be approved non-combustible. Typically that means metal. They're going to have these dimensions, so solid core door A, and then having stiles and rails that are 1 3/8 on the stiles and rails, with the interior field panels, if they are present, to be no thinner than 1 1/4 inches thick, and that doesn't include the taper-in part that goes into the stile or rail. It's just the main part of the panel. You can also have a fire resistance rating of, again, 20 minutes or less, similar to a window. So these are 3 ways that doors comply, and the wooden doors or combustible doors typically comply by the 2nd bullet. So this is a picture of a garage door, but well, this is an error. So you can also meet the requirements, as the 4th bullet indicates, using 127A1, which is a siding kind of a test. So, but all the other ones, this is a repeat slide. I apologize for that. So all the other things are the same. So that's how doors lie. Projections, these are things that bump out. They comply. I think you're sort of getting the routine of how combustible things comply, whether they're vertical or horizontal. So again, there's 4 different ways, again separated by or statements. So non-combustible, ignition resistant, 1 layer, so that the one half of a 1 hour wall is fine, and then the underside of the floor. So it can pass the horizontal projection test. You also have the option of extending the vertical wall to the ground and having that wall extended to the ground, having it comply any number of ways that a wall like exterior siding can comply. Okay, and then finally, other things on the parcel other than the primary building. I think the bottom line here is that Chapter 7A doesn't want the outbuilding to be threatening the primary building, and so I think there's a fair amount of latitude given to the authority having jurisdiction on this one. and it typically says you're going to use you know, a non-combustible ignition material, or it's going to be far enough away that it's not going to be thought to threaten the building. This is kind of a funny slide to me, anyway. I took this picture in the Grass Valley fire in 2008, and in this case, it was the primary building that, funny in a sad kind of way, that threatened the gazebo. You know, but really this is supposed to work the other way around. The gazebo isn't supposed to be built a way that if it ignites, it'll threaten the primary building. So that's the deal there. So I just wanted to show this next slide is just sort of historical for those that are interested. It's the committee that actually built 7A that was then given to the Building Standards Commission for their review. This committee was appointed by then Chief Grijalva, and the members, the committee was co-chaired by Kate Dargan, who became State Fire Marshal after Chief Grijalva, and Ethan Foote, who retired a couple of years ago from the State Fire Marshal's office, but I think is still pretty active. Anyway, so Kate and Ethan chaired the committee, and then there was a number of people from around the state, fire officials, building code officials, code people, and then some a representative of the construction industry. Chief Hoover, the current State Fire Marshal, was on this committee, and at the time she was Fire Marshal in Arinda Moraga. So it was a pretty, and then there was people that were there for testing. So Howard States, for example, was representing the commercial lab industry. So there's a number of people that were there trying to, as codes are built, you know, it's trying to have all participants at the table. Anyway, this was the committee, and the rest is sort of history. So here's just the final slide, and I think we're ready for some questions if there are any more, and I'll turn it back, I think, to Buddy. You have my contact information here if you have any questions you want to ask of me. Best way is email, but the office is my South Carolina office number. Cell phone is always with me. I'm in California today, for example, so cell phone would work better.
Okay, thanks, Steve. We actually did have quite a few questions roll in, and I want to mention to the participants that if you want your full 2 hours of credit, we'll ask you to stick around for the Q&A because that counts as part of the webinar. So stick around until the top of the hour. We've got about 20 minutes. We've got quite a few questions that Steve will be addressing, and so I think we've got time to fit all these questions in. But go ahead and continue to submit questions as well as we go through these. So first one, Steve, is do the CBC, California Building Code Chapter 7A requirements apply under the residential code to 1- and 2-family dwellings?
Yes, it applies to all buildings. And there are some exceptions to that, and those exceptions are, you know, like small outbuildings that are far away from the primary structure, but all commercial and residential are definitely in.
Okay. Next question. If a building has open eaves, does the exposed roof sheathing under the eaves need to be ignition resistant?
I'd say no. The exception for open eave only talks about the blocking between, the exposed rafters and the rafters themselves being a nominal 2-inch dimension, so 2 inches thick. That's the only thing that Chapter 7A talks about in that exception. So I'd say any kind of exposed sheathing is fine, unless there's something called locally. But from a state perspective, no.
Okay. Next question. If we have a wall assembly tested per NFPA 285 for non-combustible construction, will this meet the intent of Chapter 7A of the exterior wall covering to be non-combustible?
So I might have to get back to this individual, but the way that I'm understanding it, the way that Chapter 7A defines non-combustible is by ASTM E136, and so if that way in hasn't been done, then it won't meet the definition the way that 7A uses it. So I'd say if this individual would just email me directly or come through you, buddy, we can have a chat about it. But my understanding is that 136 is the way that non-combustibility is defined, and that's the way that it would be used.
Okay. Next question has to do with the durability of siding. Does the 127A1 have provisions for siding durability? Is there some kind of testing for advanced weathering, aging, or deformation to approximate service conditions?
That's a really good question. I really appreciate this one. The answer is no. There was a lot of chat about that, and when we were developing the standards, the SFN protocols, which became standards back in the day, we did a lot of talking about how we might do that. But at the end of the day, weathering and therefore anything that weathering might do in terms of deformation long-term or weathering, like erosion of materials long-term from a siding perspective, isn't in there. The testing is done on a brand new product that's installed at the commercial lab, and if it passes that, that's it. So I think the answer is in a short answer is no.
Okay. For wood frame construction, does stucco complying with ASTM E136 as a non-combustible material meet the requirement for compliance with Chapter 7A?
Yes.
All right, that's easy. State Fire Marshal lists some approved materials, including redwood. Can those be used?
Untreated redwood definitely has complied as a decking material. Redwood used as a siding pattern, used as siding. Untreated redwood definitely can comply. It just needs to pass the wall test, and that's typically done with sheathing installed. But yes, any kind of wood siding product, regardless of species, can comply if it passes that test. There are a number there, and any others that aren't there can be there if they pass the test. And with with sheathing and the right kind of pattern, a lap joint pattern, it's doable.
Okay. The main way people pass the deck test is through option 4 with the 25 kilowatt per square foot criteria. What is the purpose of the burning brand with a Class A brand test?
So, it's an interesting question. When the way that the option 4 came about when Chapter 7A was being built, and it was just, I think, a compromise that sort of resulted when it was handed to the State Fire Marshal's office as a protocol, it was parts A and B were in there. And parts A and B were included in the deck test because, if you remember, I'll go back to this particular slide, this one, because of the ways that decks can be vulnerable to wildfire exposures. There's embers on the top of the deck or flames that could come up underneath the deck. And each one can result in ignition of the deck. And so the protocol was intended to address those things. There's a lot of discussion these days, currently, about whether a 12-inch by 12-inch ASTM E108 brand mimics, in a good enough way, the umpteen hundreds or thousands of embers that can land on a deck potentially during an actual wildfire. Which one's more severe? Is one a good proxy for the other? I mean, can the A brand be a proxy for these other things? When this particular standard protocol, which became the standard, was being developed, we didn't really have the way to generate the embers and or fire brands. It's not to say that we couldn't have, I suppose, but it didn't really happen. So, and the Class A brand was used just because the deck is a horizontal surface and the roof is kind of a horizontal surface. And we were trying to come up with things, with procedures that could be used by a commercial lab. And since commercial lab commonly was able to do an E108 test, the decision was made to modify the E108 kind of a test for a deck and use procedures already established, including the brand. So however unlikely it would be for a Class A brand to land on your roof during a wildfire, it would be equally likely or unlikely to land on your deck. And so that's the logic in using the Class A brand. It was the most severe exposure that used sort of an off-the-shelf item in the sense that Class A brands and E108 are kind of off-the-shelf from a commercial fire lab perspective. And then at the same time trying to address this top of deck exposure scenario that you see in this particular slide. The underdeck, the flame impenger, was addressing the underdeck exposure. So I hope that explained it. If not, but if you don't think I addressed it, just sort of tell me now. We can talk about it some more.
No, I think you did a great job. We'll move on so we can get to a few more of these questions. For exterior walls complying with the non-combustible material or ignition resistance material provision, do the structural studs need to be non-combustible or ignition resistant, or just the covering?
The answer is just the covering. In every case, it's just the exterior wall, the exterior part. The exterior part, just remember that this test, well, the State Fire Marshal test is a penetration test, and the ignition material compliance option and the non-combustible material compliance option, it is just the skin part, just the part of the wall you can see. If you're going to do the State Fire Marshal test, you are allowed to count the sheathing or any other things that might be between the outside of the outer skin of the siding material and the inside of the wall cavity area. And all you're doing is evaluating the ability of the fire to move from the outside to the inside. And 7A says nothing about the structural system that's holding up the wall or the building in that area.
Okay. Let's switch gears a little bit and talk about topical treatments that can be applied like stains to give a Class A rating. Are those acceptable, or do you still need to have, say, a fire retardant treated product?
So, good question. As Chapter 7A does not allow for the use of a coating to as a way to comply with 7A provisions. So if you are going to use a fire retardant treatment, it is going to be a pressure impregnated procedure that also has undergone some kind of accelerated weathering with passing some test after the fact. Coatings are not allowed, and I think that the thought of the committee at the time, and I think the thinking even now, excuse me, I just sneezed, is that whereas coatings are used commonly inside, there are some weathering issues, long-term performance, or unpredictable usable service life kind of issues, or uncertainties with coatings, and there's a sentence in Chapter 7A that it very explicitly says coatings are not a means to comply with Chapter 7A.
Okay. Related question then is, if you do have, say, a fire retardant treated product with a Class A rating, is that compromised by staining or painting the product?
So I'll first of all, I'll answer it by saying that I think you really have to talk to the particular manufacturer to get their take on it. I did some, because I know there are some that say you cannot, or they provide certain ones that you can use. So, you know, I know that depending on the items, sometimes there are things you need to be careful of. I did some experiments years ago looking at the influence of deck coatings anyway on the performance, and I didn't see any particular problem with using a coating. So the coating I used was an oil-based coating, and it didn't add to or detract from the performance. So I walked away with the opinion that you could be indifferent to coatings. They weren't going to help you, but they weren't going to hurt you either in the long run. But I think from a manufacturer perspective, I would ask the manufacturer, because they're going to have an opinion on it, and that's going to be the one that counts at the end of the day, I think.
Okay. Switching gears again to doors with glazing, do they fall under 12.7A1 or 12.7A2, and is there a minimum amount of glazing a door can have where it is treated like a window?
Yike. I should know this. Again, I think if you could just email me, but my take on it is that the window, glazing in a door is like glazing in a window. It's got to be tempered glass, at least one pane. It's no different. And if you want to use something else, then you need to test it like a door. Test it like a window, and the glass has to pass. So.
Okay. Back to the heavy timber question again. Steve, you're probably aware that there is a definition for Type 4 heavy timber in the building code, and so there's still a little confusion of why, when you use the term heavy timber and say 4 inches in your slide, that's different from the heavy timber definition that's in Chapter 23 of the code.
Right.
Can you just expound on that a little bit?
Yeah, I'm going to expound while I look up Chapter 7A, because line in there that that actually defines it. And there's a little, I understand yeah, okay, so here we are in Chapter 7A, and this is one case where I think it's going to just be different. You know, the building code, the way that it defines heavy timber, it's a function of component, but in Chapter 7A there is a Section 702A definitions, heavy timber, type of construction classifies, a type of construction classification specified in Section 602. For use in this chapter, heavy timber shall be sawn lumber or food laminated wood with the smallest minimum nominal dimension of 4 inches, 102 millimeters. Heavy timber walls or floors shall be sawn or glue laminated planks, splined, tongue and groove, or set close together and well spiked. So, you know, I just took the 4 inches from that definition of heavy timber in Chapter 7A.
Okay, great. Great. Back to the 2-inch exposed rafter tails. When did that, I guess some were wondering, when did that requirement change, or when those 2-inch exposed rafter tails allowed? And then just again clarify the blocking between rafters on top of the exterior wall, which is also, I guess, a nominal 2-inch.
Okay, so I know, you know, because of the class that I was teaching, that this was in 2007 and 8, that this was unclear, let's say, in the original version. And so there has been a revision of Chapter 7A that occurred in like 2010, I think. And they tried to clarify this. And I think there was some discussion between the industry and the State Fire Marshal's office. And so I found this part in the code here, the new version. And so I think it wasn't so clearly defined in the way that it was first published, but it's been republished in 2010 in 707, Section 707A.4, open roof eaves. You know, it says the exposed roof deck on the underside of unenclosed roof eaves shall consist of one of the following: non-combustible, ignition resistant, 1-layer type jib, the exterior portion of 1-hour wall. So these are the ways in, and none of those are what we've talked about with a nominal 2-inch blocking. But so right under the 4th item, the exterior portion of 1-hour wall, there's an exception. The exception says the following materials do not require protection. Number 1, solid wood rafter tails on the exposed underside of open roof eaves having a minimum nominal dimension of 2 inches. Solid wood blocking between rafter tails on the exposed underside of open roof eaves having a minimum nominal dimension of 2 inches. And then another item is fascia and other architectural trim boards. So it's very clear that, to me anyway, that that exception allows nominal 2 blocking and nominal 2 rafter tails, and it's kind of silent on the sheathing. But you know, that may be something that's left to interpretation, but I've always just understood that to mean that the critical component would be the exposed rafter tail and the blocking between rafter tails, and that a nominal 2 in those areas comply.
Okay. we're at the top of the hour, but if you could answer this question in maybe 30 seconds or less. Are there any exceptions for new residential construction with sprinkler protection if the 13R sprinkler system is used instead of a 13D?
So I think the bottom line is I don't know for sure the distinction between the 13s. There is the exception for venting, saying that if the attic is sprinkled, but I don't think it's sprinkled. I don't think it's defined quite so specifically that you don't need to worry about other components. But that was an exception, was if it was sprinklered. But I don't remember that it was so specific about which provision you're meeting.
The question wasn't specific, but that pretty much takes us to the end of our time. Steve, I appreciate an excellent presentation and great Q&A session. Thank you all who are participating. Marcy's going to come back now and just wrap things up for us, and there will likely be some follow-up with some of the email questions that were asked. If Steve wants to clarify some things, we've got your email addresses, and obviously you've got his contact information. So Marcy, take it away.